My name is Robert, and for 31 years I was a father. For 31 years I was a provider, a protector, and a man who believed truly, deeply believed that if you poured yourself into the people you loved, they would never let you drown. I was the kind of man who thought love was a two-way current, that it flowed back to you the same way you sent it out. I was wrong, not a little wrong, not the kind of wrong you brush off and forget. And that, and that. I was the kind of wrong that hollows you out from the inside, leaves you standing in your own kitchen on a Sunday evening wondering how a man who gave everything ended up with nothing to show for it but a plate of cold food and an empty chair. The moment I understood the truth about my daughter didn't happen in a screaming match. It didn't happen in a lawyer's office or a hospital waiting room. It happened at my own dining table, in my own home, while a woman I had never liked sat in my chair and smiled at me like I was the help. But you need to understand where I came from before you can understand what I lost. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. My father worked the line at a GM plant for 37 years. My mother cleaned houses 3 days a week and took in ironing on the other 2. We weren't poor in the way that gets written about in books, but we were the kind of family that knew exactly how much was in the checking account at all times because the number mattered. I wore my cousin's hand-me-down shoes until I was 16. I know what it feels like to want something you cannot have. That feeling never left me, even after I didn't need it anymore. I put myself through 2 years of community college, then transferred and finished a business degree at night while I worked days at a wholesale food distributor. I drove a forklift. I loaded trucks. I cataloged inventory in a freezer wearing gloves with the fingers cut off so I could still hold a pen. By the time I was 30, I had saved enough to buy into a small commercial kitchen supply company with a man named Frank Delaney, who I still consider the finest business partner I ever had. We built that company over 20 years into something real. We supplied restaurants, hospitals, university cafeterias, anyone who needed commercial refrigeration, industrial ovens, stainless steel prep counters. It wasn't glamorous work, and I never pretended it was, but it was honest and it was mine. My wife, Carol, was the reason any of it made sense. We met at a church potluck in 1988, which sounds like the beginning of a joke, but it wasn't. In 1988, she had made a lemon pound cake that was so good I told her I would marry her if she made it again. She laughed and said she would think about it. 6 months later, I was standing at an altar in a rented tuxedo, and she was walking toward me in her mother's altered dress, and I thought, this is everything, this is the whole point. Our daughter, Nicole, came along in 1992. She was the best thing Carol and I ever made together. Smart from the beginning, reading before kindergarten, asking questions that made her teachers uncomfortable by 2nd grade. She was going to be something. I knew it, the same way, a storm is coming before the clouds turn. You just feel it in the air. I want to be honest with sons and daughters reading this, because you deserve honesty more than you deserve a comfortable story. I gave Nicole too much. Not too much love, I don't think that's possible, but too much ease, too much cushion between her and the hard parts of the world. I paid for her college at a private university without a single loan on her name. I bought her a car for graduation, and when she got into law school and she did get in on her own merit, I want to be clear about that, I paid the tuition. All 3 years. $240,000. I never once asked her to pay me back. I never once dangled it over her head. I gave it because I loved her and because I could, and because I had spent my whole childhood promising myself that my children would never have to grind the way I had. Maybe that was my first mistake. Not the giving without the teaching. I gave her the result of my sacrifice, without ever letting her see the sacrifice itself. And she grew up understanding that things came, but not where they came from. Carol died in the spring of 2019. Pancreatic cancer, which is as fast and as cruel as anything I have ever witnessed. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I sat in that hospital room every single night. I slept in a chair that left permanent aches in my lower back that I still feel on cold mornings. I held her hand through things I won't describe because she deserves her dignity even in memory. She was 61 years old. She had plans. She had a trip to Portugal she had been saving magazine clippings about for 3 years. She never got to go. Nicole came to the hospital. She cried. She was grieving, and I knew that, and I held space for it. But grief does strange things to people. Some people it breaks open into softness. Others it hardens, pulls them toward survival mode, toward the people who make them feel safe and unthreatened. Nicole had been dating a man named Preston Walsh for about 18 months at that point. I had met him 4 times. He was a corporate attorney, sharp, well-dressed, the kind of man who makes you feel slightly underdressed even when you're wearing your best. His family had money. Old money, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because everyone already knows. His mother, Diane Walsh, was the sort of woman who had never once in her adult life been told no by anyone who mattered. I did not like Preston. I want to be honest about that too. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't the cliché of a father not thinking any man was good enough for his daughter. It was something specific I noticed in the way he looked at things. He looked at my house the way an appraiser looks at a property, calculating its value, finding its deficiencies. He looked at me with a patience that felt practiced, like tolerating me was something he had prepared for. Nicole and Preston married 14 months after Carol passed. The wedding was beautiful and expensive, and I helped pay for it because that is what fathers do. I sat in the front row, and I watched my daughter walk down the aisle, and I thought about Carol, and I pressed my thumbnail into my palm to keep from crying in front of people I didn't know. I succeeded. I smiled. And I danced at the reception. I gave a toast that made people laugh and then tear up, because I knew how to do that much at least. What happened after the wedding happened slowly, the way water finds its way through a foundation. You don't notice the crack until the wall is wet. Nicole and Preston moved into their condo downtown, which was fine. They came for dinner less and less. When they did come, Preston was always somewhere else in the house on his phone, looking out windows, wandering through rooms with his hands in his pockets in a way that made my skin crawl. Nicole would apologize for him with her eyes when he wasn't looking. I pretended not to see it. Then she called me in September and told me they needed a place to stay while their condo building was being renovated. Water damage from the unit above them. It would be 6 to 8 weeks, she said. Of course, I told her. Of course, you'll come stay. This is your home. That was 11 months before the night everything changed. The 6 to 8 weeks became 3 months, then 6, then nearly a year. At some point the condo was clearly fine again. I heard Preston on a phone call in the hallway mentioning something about their building's renovation being wrapped up, but no one said anything about leaving. Diane Walsh began coming over for dinner. First every other week, then weekly, then twice a week. She would arrive with opinions about my curtains and my kitchen organization, and once, memorably, she rearranged the items on my kitchen counter while I was in the other room and seemed surprised when I put them back. Nicole laughed it off. Preston said nothing. I said it once, quietly and directly, and Diane looked at me with an expression that was almost pitying, as if I was a child who didn't understand how adults arrange things. I should have said more. I should have drawn the line then. If you take nothing else from my story, daughters and sons, take this. The moment you allow someone to rearrange your kitchen, you have told them something important about what you will accept, and they will remember it. The night everything changed was a Saturday in late October. Nicole had organized what she called a dinner party. My house, my dining room, my table, the long mahogany table that Carol and I had driven 4 hours to an estate sale in Kentucky to buy because Carol had fallen in love with it in a photograph. That table had held 23 years of Sunday dinners. It had held birthday cakes and Thanksgiving turkeys and the homework of a little girl who was going to be a lawyer someday. The guest list was 11 people. Diane Walsh was there, with her husband Gerald, a quiet man who spent most of the evening looking at his phone, several of Preston's colleagues and their wives. A woman from Nicole's firm that I had met once before. I didn't recognize most of them. I was in my own house, surrounded by strangers eating food that Nicole and Diane had apparently planned together without asking me what I might like served. I had come downstairs from my study about 20 minutes before dinner. I was trying. I shook hands. I made conversation. I made conversation. I asked Gerald about his golf game, which he seemed to appreciate because no one else had. I refilled my glass of water, and I stood near the kitchen doorway, and I felt, very acutely, like a coat rack. Present but not functional. Something people walked past without seeing. Nicole came to me while the others were still milling around with their wine glasses. She had a particular expression on her face, not shame exactly, but the cousin of it. The look of someone who has already made a decision and now needs to deliver it without accepting the weight of it. Dad, she said quietly, pulling me slightly around the corner. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be understanding. I waited. The seating at the table, she said. We have 12 chairs and 12 people, which works out exactly. But the thing is, Diane needs to sit at the head of the table, next to Preston. It's kind of a family thing for them. She always sits at the head at family dinners, and Preston really wants her to feel comfortable tonight. I looked at her. I heard every word, and my brain processed them the way it processes information in a dream, perfectly clearly and yet completely unable to make them real. That's my seat, I said. I know, Dad. I know. That's why I'm asking instead of just doing it. But there's a spot for you at the end by the kitchen. It's still at the table. You'll still be part of everything. By the kitchen, I repeated. She had the grace to look away. Just for tonight. It's one dinner. I looked past her into the dining room. Diane Walsh was already standing at the head of my table, one hand resting on the back of my chair, gesturing with her wine glass as she talked to one of Preston's colleagues. She had not asked. She had not been shown to the seat. She had found it the way people find things they have already decided belong to them. Preston caught my eye from across the room. He gave me a small nod, the kind of nod you give someone to acknowledge that you see them without implying that you owe them anything. Something happened inside me in that moment that I don't have clean words for. It wasn't rage, though rage was part of it. It was more like clarity. Like a fever breaking. Like, inside, I saw my dining room, my mahogany table that Carol loved, my daughter in her expensive dress in my house that I had paid for and heated and maintained and opened to these people, and I saw myself being tucked away at the end near the kitchen door like something slightly embarrassing, like a piece of furniture that didn't quite fit the new aesthetic. I thought about the forklift. I thought about the freezer with the cut-off gloves. I thought about Carol's lemon pound cake and the rented tuxedo and the airport blue light of a hospital room at 3 in the morning. I thought about $240,000 and a car and 31 years of giving everything I had to a daughter I would have walked through fire for. I nodded once. All right, I said. Go enjoy your dinner, Nicole. She looked relieved. She put her hand on my arm briefly. Thank you, Dad. I knew you'd understand. Thank you. I understood more than she knew. I did not go sit by the kitchen door. I went upstairs to my study. I sat in the chair by the window, the one I had sat in 1,000 evenings with a book or a glass of bourbon or just the quiet company of my own thoughts. I listened to the sound of the dinner party rising from below. Laughter, the scrape of chairs, the sound of Diane Walsh's carrying voice holding court at the head of my table. I picked up my phone and I called my attorney. His name is Walter Gaines, and we have known each other for over 20 years. He answered on the third ring, which told me he was still in his office even at 7 on a Saturday evening, which is exactly the kind of man I needed. Walter, I said, I need to talk to you. Not tomorrow. Tonight, if you can. He could. I drove to his office. I sat across from him in a room lined with law books, and I told him everything. Not just the dinner, all of it, the 11 months. The condo that had mysteriously needed no one to return to it. Diane rearranging my kitchen. The gradual, methodical way my house had stopped feeling like mine. The company because I had made the same mistake as before. When Frank Delaney retired 2 years ago, I had brought Nicole in as a partial partner, given her a 20% stake as an early inheritance. She had a seat on the board. I had been generous. And I had been sentimental. Walter listened without interrupting. Then he said, Robert, how much of your estate planning is current? That was when I began to understand the shape of what I needed to do. The next morning, I came downstairs at 7. Nicole and Preston were in the kitchen. Nicole was making coffee, and Preston was reading something on his phone at my kitchen table with his feet hooked around the chair legs like a man who had lived there his whole life. Dad? Nicole said, smiling, a little uncertain. Did you want breakfast? No, I said. I want you to sit down, both of you. Something in my voice reached her. She set the coffee pot down. They sat. I've been thinking, I said, and I've made some decisions I want to share with you. This isn't a conversation. I'm not looking for input. I'm telling you. Preston set his phone face down on the table. A small, instinctive gesture. He knew. Lek. Instinctive gesture. He knew. I want you both out of this house within 30 days. That's not negotiable, and it's not a reaction to last night. It's a conclusion I've come to over a longer period of time than you probably realize. You're welcome to stay in a hotel, return to the condo, or make any other arrangements you choose, but this house will be mine again by the 1st of next month. Nicole's face moved through several things quickly. Surprise, hurt, then something calculated. Dad, you're being... I'm not finished, I said. I'm also rescinding Nicole's stake in the company. I've spoken with Walter Gaines, and the legal steps are underway. Entwen said. The partnership documents have a buyout clause, and I will exercise it at fair market valuation. Preston looked up then, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time. You can't just, he started. I can, I said. Read the documents. Walter drew them. There was a silence. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard. Dad, Nicole said, and her voice had dropped to something smaller, younger. Is this because of the seat? It's because of 11 months, I said. The seat was just the night I finally saw clearly. Preston left the table. I heard him on his phone in the hallway, speaking in a low, rapid voice that I recognized it was the voice of a man calling a damage control attorney. Nicole stayed. She sat across from me with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, and she looked at me, and for a moment I saw the second-grade girl who asked questions that made her teachers uncomfortable, and it nearly broke me. But I had been nearly broken before. I knew what was on the other side of it. They fought it, of course. Preston's legal team was formidable. I'll give them that. They argued constructive eviction, hostile environment, emotionally coercive behavior. They argued that the stake in the company had been a gift, not a loan, not a conditional arrangement. They brought Diane Walsh in as a character witness, which I thought was a bold choice given that she was one of the central reasons we were in a courtroom to begin with. She testified that I had always seemed welcoming of her involvement in the household. I did not smile, but I wanted to. What Preston and Nicole's team had not counted on was the conversation I'd had with Walter the night of the dinner party, during which I had been thorough. Walter had advised me, a month earlier during an unrelated estate review, to begin documenting certain things. I had emails, I had dated notes, I had a text from Nicole from 6 weeks prior in which she referred to the house as our home in a context that was clearly possessive rather than familial. Small things. Anyway, but small things are the mortar that holds a legal case together. And then there was the bank account. While reviewing the company financials with Walter, we discovered that over the prior 8 months, Nicole had been authorizing small transfers from the business operating account to a personal account in Preston's name. The amounts were modest individually, never more than $4,000 at a time, but the pattern was consistent and undeniable. 19 transfers. Approximately $63,000. When I sat in that courtroom and the forensic accountant presented the figures, I watched my daughter's face go through something I had never seen on it before, not guilt that came later. What I saw first was shock that I had looked closely enough to find it. The judge's ruling was not dramatic. Rulings rarely are. But it was complete. Nicole was ordered to repay the misappropriated funds with interest. The mater bias, the stake transfer, was ruled invalid based on the breach of fiduciary conduct. I was granted full possession of the property, uncontested. Preston's attorneys made a final motion that was denied in 11 words. What I remember most is not the gavel. It is the moment after, when we were all standing in the corridor outside the courtroom and I looked at my daughter and she looked at me and there was nothing between us but quiet. Diane Walsh was on a bench down the hallway with her coat folded across her lap. She did not look like a woman who sat at the heads of other people's tables. She looked like what she had always been, a woman who overreached and had to watch it unravel. Preston put his hand on Nicole's shoulder and said something into her ear. I couldn't hear it. Then he walked toward the elevator and Nicole stood there. And she was my daughter, and I felt the love I have always felt for her, and I felt the pain of it in a way that I don't have words for because I don't think the English language has made them yet. I nodded to her, just that. Then I walked out. I want to tell you what the next weeks looked like, because I think you deserve to hear the other side of this kind of story, the part that doesn't get talked about because it doesn't fit neatly into either victory or tragedy. It was very quiet. I redecorated nothing. I moved no furniture. I sat at the head of my mahogany table every single morning with my coffee, and I read the news on my phone the way I always had. And the silence was not comfortable at first, and then, gradually, it was. I started calling some old friends I had let drift. A man named Curtis who I'd played racquetball with through most of the 90s until life got busy. A woman from Carol's book club who had sent me a card when Carol died that I had never properly thanked her for. Small connections. Real ones. 3 months after the ruling, a letter arrived. Nicole's handwriting, on the envelope. I recognized it the same way I recognized her eyes, and the particular laugh she had when something genuinely surprised her. I sat at the kitchen table, my kitchen table, and I opened it. She wrote that she was sorry. She wrote that she had told herself, for a long time, that what she was doing was reasonable, that she was simply building a life, that Preston's family did things a certain way, that she had earned a kind of authority in that house by virtue of how much she had lost. Her mother, her childhood. She had convinced herself that ease was owed to her. She wrote that she understood, now, where that logic led. She wrote that she missed me in a way that had no solution she could see. She did not ask to come back. She did not ask for anything. And she said she was working with a therapist. She said she had left the firm and taken a position at a smaller practice that did housing law, which she thought Carol might have approved of. She did not mention Preston. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it carefully and put it in the drawer of the nightstand on my side of the bed, the side I have slept on for 30 years. Not in a fireplace. Not in a trash can. And in the drawer. Because some things deserve to be kept even when you don't yet know what to do with them. I have not called her. Not yet. I am not ready, and I am too old and have lost too much to pretend otherwise. But I think about what I want fathers and mothers who are hearing this to understand. Not the revenge. That part is the smallest part of the story, even though it is the loudest. What I want you to understand is what happened before any of it. I want you to understand that I sat in a chair in the kitchen of a house I built, listening to my daughter's dinner party, and I was invisible, and I let it happen slowly for nearly a year before I reached the end of myself. The lesson I carry is not about courts or legal strategy or financial leverage. It is simply this: you are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to sit at your own table, not because you own it in a legal sense, but because you earned the right to belong there through decades of showing up, of grinding away in the cold, of sitting in hospital chairs, of loving people with everything you had even when it cost you. Daughters and sons, hear me on this. The people who love you, really love you, will never ask you to make yourself smaller so that someone else can feel larger. That is not love. That is convenience. And you are worth more than someone else's convenience, no matter how long it takes you to believe it. I am 63 years old. My back aches on cold mornings. I make my own coffee and I sit at a table that Carol picked out at an estate sale in Kentucky, and some mornings the light comes through the kitchen window in a way that reminds me of her, and it still hurts, and I think it always will. But it is my light and my window and my table and my life, and nobody is taking my seat again.